When did breaking a rule save your life? My parents banned me from learning the local language because they said it would dilute my cultural purity. We moved here when I was 18 months old for Dad's job, and 17 years later we were still here, living in an expat bubble where nobody had to interact with locals. My parents sent me to the International Academy, where everything was taught in our language by imported teachers who cost more than most locals made in 5 years. They genuinely believed learning the local language would erase my heritage and turn me into someone they couldn't recognize, pointing to other expat kids who'd gone native as cautionary tales. I lived in a country where I couldn't talk to 90% of the people. Every interaction outside our bubble required a translator or embarrassing hand gestures that made me look like an idiot tourist. I watched local kids my age hanging out in coffee shops and playing soccer in the park, but I couldn't join them because I literally couldn't communicate beyond pointing and smiling. My parents said this was good because local kids would be a bad influence, teaching me their backward ways and making me forget my superior education. They didn't understand that I had no connection to a homeland I couldn't even remember while being locked out of the only country I'd ever known. When I turned 14, I started secretly learning the language using a phone I bought with birthday money and hid in my school locker. Every lunch break, I'd sit in the furthest bathroom stall with headphones, working through language apps, and watching local shows with subtitles. After 2 years, I was nearly fluent, but had to pretend I couldn't understand anything around my parents. The hardest part was stopping myself from reacting when people talked about us in public, assuming we couldn't understand their comments about rich foreigners who thought they were too good to integrate. Sometimes locals would say horrible things about my mom's clothes or my dad's attitude while we stood right there, and I had to keep my face completely blank. My whole double life worked perfectly until that Saturday at the imported goods store my parents loved because all the staff spoke our language. We were shopping for Mom's birthday party when a man burst through the entrance, waving something metallic that caught the fluorescent lights. He was shouting instructions that made everyone drop to the floor immediately, except for us and 2 other foreign families who just stood there confused. The man's face was covered with a bandana, and his eyes were wild as he pointed his weapon at the cowering cashiers and kept yelling the same phrases over and over. My parents were completely frozen because they had no idea what was happening beyond the obvious threat. Dad actually started walking toward the exit, which made the man spin around and scream directly at him while jabbing the weapon in his direction. Dad just kept walking because he didn't understand the man was telling him to get on the ground or he'd make an example out of him. The man started counting down from 5 in the local language, his finger moving toward what was clearly a trigger, and my parents just stood there like confused tourists waiting for someone to translate. "Get on the ground right now because he's about to shoot Dad," I screamed at my parents in our language while dropping to my knees. The shock on their faces wasn't from the death threat, but from hearing me translate perfectly. Mom's mouth fell open as I rapidly explained that the man wanted everyone's phones in a pile, women's jewelry in a bag, and nobody to look at his face or he'd assume they were trying to memorize features for the police. I translated his demands about keeping our faces pressed to the tiles and not moving until he was gone, about how he'd already killed someone at another store who tried to be a hero. While I was trying to save our lives, my mother actually hissed at me about how long I'd been lying to them, and my father's face turned red with rage, even as he finally lowered himself to the ground. The armed man was collecting valuables from terrified shoppers, and my parents were more concerned about my betrayal than the fact that we were in mortal danger. "You've been deceiving us this entire time like some ungrateful snake," Mom whispered, while the armed man stood 3 feet away, shoving jewelry into a canvas bag. The robber heard us talking in our foreign language and spun around, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. He stalked over and pressed the cold metal against my temple, screaming something I understood perfectly, but my parents couldn't comprehend at all. He thought we were secretly calling the police in a language he didn't understand, and he was telling me I had 5 seconds to prove we weren't, or he'd paint the walls with my brains. My parents were staring at me in horror, not understanding why the weapon was now pointed at my head, and I had to decide whether to translate his threat and send my parents into hysterics, or stay silent and hope he didn't pull the trigger. He started counting down in the local language, and my parents still had no idea what those numbers meant. 4, 3, he counted, while my hands shook against the cold floor tiles. I raised my head slowly and looked him straight in the eyes. "We're just scared tourists who want to go home," I said in perfect local dialect. His counting stopped and his eyes went wide behind the bandana. "We understand everything you're saying and we're following all your instructions." The metal pressed harder against my skull for a second, before he pulled it back slightly. My parents were frozen beside me, not understanding why I was suddenly speaking fluently in the forbidden language. The robber studied my face for what felt like hours, but was probably 5 seconds. "You speak like you were born here," he said suspiciously. I kept my voice steady, even though my whole body was shaking. "I've lived here my whole life, but my parents don't speak the language at all." He looked at my terrified parents who were staring at me with complete shock. "They have no idea what we're saying right now, and they're not calling anyone." The robber lowered his weapon completely and stepped back, still watching us carefully. He grabbed the canvas bag full of jewelry and phones from where he'd dropped it. "Everyone stays down for 5 minutes after I leave or I come back shooting," he shouted to the whole store. Then he pointed at me one more time. "You tell them exactly what I said." He backed toward the door while I translated his warning to my parents in our language. Mom's face went white, and Dad's jaw clenched, so hard I thought his teeth might crack. The robber kicked the door open and sprinted into the street. Everyone stayed frozen on the floor, some people crying quietly, others just breathing hard. I started counting in my head to track the 5 minutes. After maybe 30 seconds, we heard sirens getting closer and closer. Nobody moved until the sirens were right outside. The cashiers jumped up first and ran to lock the doors. One of them, an older woman who'd always been nice to us, started checking if anyone was hurt. She spoke to us in our language, asking if we were okay. My mother burst into tears, and my father's face turned purple with rage. He was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. The cashier looked confused by the tension between us, but kept checking on other customers. More people started getting up slowly, some hugging each other, others calling family on the store's phone since all our cells were stolen. My legs felt like jelly when I finally stood up. The weight of what just happened crashed into me all at once. I'd almost been shot in the head, and my parents were more upset about my language skills than the fact I'd nearly died. Police officers rushed in after the cashiers unlocked the doors for them. They started organizing everyone, speaking slowly in the local language to the confused foreign families. One officer approached our group and started asking questions in the local language. Without thinking, I started to translate for my parents. Dad's hand shot out and grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks. "We need someone who speaks our language," he told the officer in broken English. The officer nodded and radioed for a bilingual colleague. We waited in awkward silence while other families gave their statements. Mom kept sniffling and wiping her eyes, while Dad kept his death grip on my arm. I could feel his fury building with every passing minute. Finally, a bilingual officer arrived, a young woman who introduced herself politely in our language. She took out a notebook and started asking about what we saw. My parents told her about the robber, the weapon, the demands for valuables. When she asked if the robber said anything specific to us, I stayed quiet. Dad answered that we didn't understand anything he said. The officer looked at me, and I just nodded, not mentioning the gun against my head or the countdown. She seemed to sense something was off, but continued professionally. "Did anyone in your family understand what the robber was saying?" she asked directly. Dad's grip tightened on my arm. "No. None of us speak the local language," he lied smoothly. I kept my face blank even though I wanted to scream. The officer finished taking our information and said someone would contact us if they needed anything else. The ride home was completely silent, except for Mom's occasional sniffles. Dad drove faster than usual, taking turns too sharp, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I sat in the back seat feeling the storm building. Every red light made the silence heavier. Our house came into view and my stomach clenched. The garage door wasn't even closed before Dad started screaming. "How long have you been lying to us?" His voice echoed off the walls. "How long have you been sneaking around behind our backs like some common criminal?" Mom ran straight to my room while he yelled. 2 years? 3 years? The whole time? I tried to answer, but he kept shouting over me. "Who taught you? Where did you practice? How did you hide this from us?" Mom came back holding my hidden phone, the one I thought was so well concealed in my closet. "I found it," she said quietly. Dad snatched it from her hands and powered it on. The language learning app opened immediately. He scrolled through months of practice sessions, vocabulary lists, recorded conversations I'd made to check my pronunciation. Mom found the saved screenshots of local social media posts. "You've been studying their slang?" she cried. "You've become exactly what we tried to prevent." Dad's face got redder as he found the local TV shows I'd downloaded. "This is what you do instead of studying?" He held the phone up like evidence in a trial. "This is how you repay everything we've done for you?" Without warning, he threw the phone against the wall where it shattered into pieces. "Dad, I literally just saved our lives back there," I tried to explain. "If I hadn't understood what he was saying, you would have been shot for not following his orders." His eyes got even angrier. "You put us in danger by talking to him. If you'd stayed quiet like you were supposed to, he never would have noticed us." The logic made zero sense, but he was beyond reasoning. "Your foreign chatter made him suspicious and almost got you killed." Mom was crying again, going through my backpack and finding nothing suspicious. "We gave you everything," she kept saying. "The best education, the best opportunities, and you threw it all away to become like them." Dad pulled out his phone and started making calls. First to my school, demanding they check my internet history and restrict my computer access. Then to the IT department at his company, asking about parental control software. "You're grounded indefinitely," he announced. "No leaving the house except for school." He grabbed my laptop from my desk and my tablet from my nightstand. "These are mine now." He even took my school calculator that had internet access. "You'll get a basic one that can only do math." Mom went through every drawer, every pocket, looking for any other hidden devices. They were locking me down completely, treating me like a prisoner in my own home. I stood there watching them dismantle my life, knowing that arguing would only make things worse. The next few months were going to be hell, but at least I was alive to endure them. The next morning, Mom drove me to the school without saying a single word. She parked in the visitor spot and walked straight to the administrator's office with me trailing behind. The secretary looked up surprised, since parents usually just dropped kids off. Mom told the administrator I'd been corrupted by local influences and needed constant supervision during computer time. She actually used those exact words while I stood there staring at the floor. The administrator shifted in his chair and kept glancing at me like he wanted to ask if I was okay. He typed something on his computer and said they'd monitor my internet usage more closely. Mom nodded and left without even looking at me. At lunch, the office assistant found me in the cafeteria and said the counselor wanted to see me. I walked down the long hallway to Simona Cabrera's office, wondering what this was about. She had a gentle smile when I walked in and asked me to sit down. She spoke in our language, but I noticed she had a slight local accent, like she'd been here a long time. She said she heard about the robbery and wanted to make sure I was okay. She explained that trauma could show up in different ways, and I didn't have to handle everything alone. I just nodded because I didn't know what to say. That evening we were eating dinner when the phone rang. Dad answered, and his face got tight when he heard who it was. Detective Samir Medina was calling to request I come to the station for a follow-up statement. Dad started to refuse, but the detective must have explained through his translator that my testimony was crucial, since I understood what the robber said. Mom and Dad argued quietly in the kitchen for 10 minutes. Finally, Dad came back and said we'd go tomorrow after school, but they were coming with me. The next day, we drove to the police station in complete silence. The building was old with cracked paint and flickering lights in the lobby. Detective Medina met us at the front desk and led us to a small interview room. He had a notebook and a recorder on the table. I carefully translated every word the robber had said while my parents sat there watching me with disgust. The detective wrote everything down and asked about specific phrases that might help identify the suspect. He wanted to know about the robber's accent and if he used any unusual words. Dad kept interrupting to ask why these details mattered, since they already had security footage. The detective patiently explained that voice patterns and dialect could narrow down which neighborhood the robber came from. I answered every question, while feeling my parents' anger burning into my back. That weekend, everything got worse. Mom's friend called to say people were talking about our family's scandal at the imported goods store. Apparently everyone in the expat community knew I'd gone native and learned the forbidden language. The weekly dinner party invitation didn't come, and Mom spent Saturday afternoon crying in her bedroom. Dad blamed me for ruining our social standing and said I'd destroyed everything they'd worked for. Sunday was even worse when we saw other expat families at the grocery store, and they barely nodded at us. The nightmares started that same night. I'd wake up gasping with sweat soaking my sheets, feeling that cold metal against my temple again. The robber's countdown echoed in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling. I'd lie there in the dark trying to calm my breathing. I couldn't tell my parents because they were still more angry about my language skills than worried about what almost happened. The house felt like a prison where nobody talked except to give orders. 3 days later, Simona called me back to her office during lunch. She noticed the dark circles under my eyes and asked if I was sleeping okay. I shrugged, but she kept looking at me with those kind eyes until I admitted the nightmares were bad. She recommended trauma counseling and pulled out a form from her desk. She said she'd need my parents' permission to arrange it, but warned they might refuse if the therapist only worked in the local language. She offered to call them herself, but I knew that would just make things worse. That same week, Dad came home from work angrier than I'd ever seen him. His boss had called him in for a meeting about the incident because it made the local papers. The company was worried about their expat employees' safety, and Dad had to explain why his son could translate. He slammed his briefcase on the counter and said I'd humiliated him at work. His co-workers were all talking about it and asking questions he couldn't answer. Mom just sat at the kitchen table crying again, while Dad paced around yelling about reputation and respect. 2 weeks passed with my parents barely speaking to me, except to tell me to do homework or clean my room. They hired a tutor to come to our house 3 times a week for extra lessons in our cultural history and language. The tutor was an older woman who seemed confused when I already knew everything she tried to teach. She'd bring workbooks, and I'd finish them in minutes. She'd quiz me on history, and I'd get every answer right. After the 3rd session, she asked my parents why I needed tutoring when I clearly knew the material perfectly. Mom just said I needed to be reinforced in my heritage, and the tutor shrugged and kept coming. The lessons were pointless, but my parents paid her anyway, thinking they could somehow erase what I'd learned. Then Detective Medina called again on a Thursday evening. He said they'd identified several suspects from security footage and needed me to listen to voice recordings. Mom immediately said we should just forget the whole thing happened. Dad argued that he wanted the criminal caught and punished. They went back and forth for 20 minutes while the detective waited on the phone. Finally, Dad agreed we'd come to the station that weekend to listen to the recordings. Saturday morning, Dad drove us to the police station in complete silence, while Mom sat in the back seat with me like I was some kind of criminal they had to guard. The building was old concrete with small windows and metal detectors at the entrance that beeped when Dad's keys went through. Detective Medina met us in the lobby wearing the same wrinkled suit from before and led us down a narrow hallway that smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner. He brought us into a small room with a table and 4 chairs where a laptop sat open with headphones plugged in. Mom and Dad stood against the wall with their arms crossed while Detective Medina explained he'd play 5 recordings, and I should tell him if any matched the robber's voice. The first recording started, and I shook my head immediately because the voice was too high and the accent was wrong. The second one had the right tone but spoke too slowly and carefully, like someone reading from a script. Then the 3rd recording began, and my whole body went cold because it was him. That same rough voice with the specific way he rolled certain sounds that people from the eastern districts did. I nodded and pointed at the screen while Detective Medina wrote notes and thanked me for the positive identification. He said this was huge for the case, and my parents actually looked surprised that my forbidden language skills were helping catch a criminal. We left the station, and Dad drove us home without saying anything, but I caught him looking at me in the mirror with an expression I couldn't read. 3 days later, I was sitting at the coffee shop near school doing homework when someone sat down across from me and said my name in the local language. Isabella Rios had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and was holding a newspaper with my photo from the robbery story on the front page. She said she recognized me and wanted to tell me how brave I was for helping everyone that day. Her words came out fast in the local language, and I had to concentrate to keep up with her accent, but it felt amazing to have a real conversation with someone my age. She asked about the robbery, and I told her the basic facts while she listened with wide eyes and kept shaking her head at how scary it must have been. Then she started telling me about her own life, how her parents moved here from another country when she was 5, and she understood what it was like being stuck between two worlds. We talked for over an hour about school and music and movies, and she wrote her phone number on a napkin before she had to leave for work. She said we should hang out sometime, and I nodded, even though I knew I couldn't call her without a phone since my parents destroyed mine. Walking home, I felt lighter than I had in weeks, until I opened our front door and found my parents waiting in the living room with serious faces. Someone from the expat community had seen me at the coffee shop talking to a local girl and immediately reported it to my mother at her book club. Dad stood up and said if I kept associating with locals, they'd send me to boarding school in our home country immediately. Mom was crying again and saying I was destroying everything they'd worked to preserve about our culture and heritage. I went to my room and marked days on my calendar, counting down the months until my 18th birthday when I could finally make my own choices. 2 weeks passed with my parents watching my every move and driving me to and from the school themselves to prevent any unauthorized stops. Then, on a Thursday evening, Detective Medina showed up at our door without calling first, which made my father angry about the lack of respect for privacy. The detective ignored his complaints and announced they'd arrested the robbery suspect based on my voice identification and other evidence they gathered. He needed me to testify at a preliminary hearing in 6 weeks where I'd have to publicly confirm my identification in court. My parents went pale at the thought of me speaking the local language in front of judges and lawyers and newspaper reporters. Mom started arguing that I was too young and traumatized to testify, but Detective Medina explained that without my testimony, the case would be much weaker. The next morning, our phone started ringing at 7 with calls from other expat families who'd heard about the arrest through their connections. Suddenly, my parents were getting praised for raising such a helpful son who assisted the police in catching a dangerous criminal. Dad's boss called to congratulate him, and Mom's friends wanted to know all the details over lunch at the club. They didn't know how to handle the positive attention when they'd been so angry about my language skills for weeks. Mom kept saying it was complicated when people asked how I knew the language well enough to help with the investigation. Meanwhile, at the school, I was getting stared at in the hallways and whispered about in the cafeteria, which made my anxiety worse. Simona noticed me eating alone in empty classrooms and called me to her office where she offered to let me do homework there during lunch. She set up a quiet corner with a desk and chair where I could work without the gossip and stares bothering me. She taught me breathing exercises to help with the panic attacks that kept hitting me at random times when loud noises made me think of the gun. She even let me use her computer to research universities in other cities where I could start fresh after graduation. Every lunch period became my escape, where I could focus on my future instead of my present situation. 3 weeks before the hearing date, my parents hired an expensive lawyer to figure out if they could prevent me from testifying. The lawyer came to our house with a briefcase full of papers and explained that my testimony was voluntary since I was still 17. But he also warned that withdrawing now would look suspicious and might hurt the case against someone who'd threatened multiple families. I told them I was going to testify no matter what they said, because it was the right thing to do. Dad slammed his hand on the table, and Mom left the room crying, but I didn't back down this time. 2 nights later, we were watching TV when something crashed through our living room window and glass went everywhere. Dad jumped up and found a rock with a note tied to it, lying on the carpet among the broken glass. The note was written in the local language, and I had to translate the threat warning us not to testify or face consequences. My parents were terrified and wanted to call Detective Medina immediately to report the threat and cancel my testimony. I explained that backing out now would make things worse because it would show the criminals they could intimidate witnesses. Detective Medina arrived within 20 minutes and took the rock and note as evidence while assigning a patrol car to check our street every hour. He looked directly at me and spoke in the local language, ignoring my parents' discomfort, telling me I was brave for doing the right thing despite the pressure. It was the first time since this whole mess started that an adult had actually validated my choices instead of making me feel guilty. The next morning at the school, I went straight to Simona's office during lunch like I'd been doing for weeks now. She had her computer set up in the corner for me, and while I was working on homework, a notification popped up on the messaging app. Isabella had found me through the school directory and sent a simple message asking if I was okay after everything with the rock through our window. I typed back quickly while Simona graded papers at her desk, pretending not to notice me using her computer for something besides homework. Isabella sent me a link to a local news article about the robbery case moving forward, and then a funny video of a cat falling off a couch that made me laugh for the first time in days. We started messaging every day during lunch, and she'd send me articles about what was happening in the city, videos from local comedy shows, pictures of street art I'd never get to see myself. She helped me feel connected to the world outside my parents' bubble, even though I was still trapped inside it. Simona would glance over sometimes when I was smiling at the screen, but never said anything about me using her computer for personal stuff. The days passed in this weird rhythm of morning classes, lunch messages with Isabella, afternoon classes, and tense dinners at home where my parents barely looked at me. 3 weeks went by like this until the night before the preliminary hearing, when I couldn't sleep at all. My mind kept racing through what I'd have to say in court, how I'd have to describe that gun against my head while my parents watched from the gallery. Around midnight, I got dressed quietly and slipped out my bedroom window, something I'd never done before in my life. The neighborhood was different at night, with streetlights making long shadows and the sound of distant music from somewhere down the road. I walked for 20 minutes until I found a 24-hour cafe filled with locals my age studying for exams and chatting over coffee. Nobody looked at me weird or asked why I was there alone at 1 in the morning. I ordered a coffee in the local language and sat at a corner table watching everyone else living their normal lives. A group at the next table was arguing about soccer teams, and 2 girls near the window were helping each other with math homework. For 3 hours, I sat there feeling like a regular person, not the expat kid who betrayed his parents or the witness in a robbery case. Reality crashed back when I checked my phone and saw it was almost 4 in the morning. I practically ran home and climbed back through my window just as the sky was starting to get light. My alarm went off 2 hours later, and Mom drove me to the courthouse in complete silence. The preliminary hearing room was smaller than I expected, with wood panels on the walls and uncomfortable benches. My parents sat in the gallery behind me while I took my seat at the witness stand. The prosecutor asked me questions in the local language, and I answered clearly, then translated my own words into our language for the court record. I described everything from that day in the store, the man's threats, the countdown, the cold metal against my temple. The judge watched me carefully as I switched between languages, making sure every detail was captured correctly. My voice stayed steady, even though my hands were shaking under the table, where nobody could see. When I finished, the judge thanked me for my courage and clarity, saying my testimony was some of the clearest he'd heard in years. My parents' faces were impossible to read as we left the courthouse. 2 days later, the prosecutor called to say the robber had been formally charged with armed robbery and multiple counts of assault based on my testimony and the other evidence they'd collected. The local news picked up the story and ran a piece about the brave expat teen who bridged 2 worlds to get justice. Our phones started ringing constantly with reporters wanting interviews, and my parents didn't know what to do. They'd been so angry about my language skills, but now everyone was calling me a hero for having them. Mom kept telling people it was complicated when they asked how I learned the language so well. Within a week, expat families started quietly approaching me at the school or calling our house to ask if I could help translate important documents or go with them to government offices. My parents said absolutely not at first, but when their own friends from the dinner party circuit started asking for help with visa renewals and tax forms, they couldn't keep saying no without looking bad. They agreed to let me help, but only with strict supervision, making Mom or Dad come with me to every meeting. It was a tiny crack in their wall, but still a crack. Isabella heard about me helping other families and invited me to a local cultural festival that weekend. I wanted to go so badly I could taste it, but knew my parents would never agree to me going to a local event with a local friend. Instead, she spent the whole day sending me videos and photos of everything happening at the festival. She described the food vendors, the traditional dancers, the music performances, adding little voice messages explaining what everything meant. That night, I watched all her videos under my blanket with headphones, imagining what it would feel like to actually be there instead of experiencing it through a phone screen. A month after the hearing, Detective Medina called to tell us the robber had taken a plea deal. He said my testimony was so strong that the robber's lawyer convinced him to plead guilty rather than risk a trial. He was going to prison for 8 years and had to pay restitution to all the victims from both robberies. Detective Medina thanked me again and told me I should be proud of standing up for what was right even when it was scary. That night, Mom found me crying in my room, but it wasn't from sadness. It was relief that the whole legal thing was over, mixed with frustration that even after everything, I still couldn't live freely. She stood in my doorway for a moment like she was going to lecture me, then surprised me by sitting on the edge of my bed. We sat there in silence for 10 minutes, her hand almost touching mine on the bedspread, but not quite. She didn't apologize or say she understood, but the silence felt different from her usual angry silence. When she left, she squeezed my shoulder gently, and it was the most connection we'd had in months. The next week, Dad came home from work with a strange expression on his face. His company had offered him a promotion that would mean staying in this country for another 5 years minimum. The money was too good to turn down, but it meant I'd become an adult here, finish university here, probably start my career here. He actually sat down at the kitchen table and asked what I thought about it. Not demanding or telling, but asking. I told him honestly that this was my home, that I belonged to both cultures, not just one, and that trying to keep me in a bubble had only made me more desperate to break free. I explained that I could honor our heritage while also being part of the place where I'd grown up. He didn't respond right away, but I could see him thinking, really thinking about what I'd said instead of just dismissing it. It was the first real conversation we'd had since the robbery, where he actually listened to me like I was a person with valid thoughts, instead of just a disappointing son who'd betrayed the family. 2 weeks passed with Dad still thinking about the promotion while I tried to keep my head down at the school. Simona called me into her office during lunch and showed me a brochure for the local university's summer program, where high school students could take real college courses. She helped me fill out the application right there, checking boxes for advanced math and physics classes that were taught completely in the local language. When I brought the forms home for parents' signatures, Mom immediately said no, but Dad actually read through the course descriptions. The math professor was apparently famous for sending students to top engineering programs, and Dad's eyes lit up at the academic credentials listed. They argued for 3 hours while I sat at the kitchen table pretending to do homework. Mom kept saying it would expose me to more local influence, but Dad pointed out that advanced calculus was the same in any language. He finally signed the forms, but made me promise to come straight home after classes with no socializing. The expat community was slowly warming back up to us after word spread about how I'd helped catch the robber. Mrs. Henderson from the British compound actually stopped Mom at the grocery store to ask if I could help translate her driver's license renewal forms. Mom's face went red, but she agreed because Mrs. Henderson ran the book club Mom desperately wanted back into. More requests started coming in, and Mom would schedule them like business appointments, sitting in the corner while I translated documents for her friends. She never thanked me, but I noticed she bought my favorite snacks after each translation session. The women would praise my language skills to her face, and she'd force a smile while gripping her purse handle so tight her knuckles turned white. After 3 weeks of this, she'd rebuilt most of her social connections, but now as the mother of the helpful translator kid, instead of the perfect cultural preservation example. Isabella texted me about a study group at the public library every Saturday, and I spent days working up the courage to ask. Mom surprisingly said yes, but only if she came too, and sat where she could see me. That first Saturday, I walked into the library conference room where Isabella and 5 other local kids were spreading out textbooks and notebooks. She introduced me to everyone, and they switched between both languages naturally, making sure I understood the physics problems we were working through. Mom sat at a table 20 feet away, pretending to read magazines, but I caught her watching us every few minutes. The other kids were patient when I stumbled over technical terms in the local language, and one girl even shared her color-coded notes with me. We worked through problem sets for 2 hours, and I felt more normal than I had in years. Isabella walked me to Mom's table afterward and politely introduced herself, complimenting Mom's handbag in broken but sincere words from our language. The acceptance letter for the summer program arrived 6 weeks later, and my parents disappeared into their bedroom for an hour. I pressed my ear against the door and heard Dad saying the professors were world-class, and Mom countering that I'd be surrounded by local students all day. They came out with a list of conditions written on Dad's legal pad. I had to maintain straight A's, come directly home after classes, attend cultural lessons with a tutor every weekend, and have no social activities related to the program. I agreed to everything immediately, knowing that just being in those classes would give me freedom even with all their rules. My 18th birthday was exactly 3 months away, and I started planning carefully. Isabella mentioned her older brother did legal aid work helping young adults, and I asked her to quietly get his contact information. Every translation job my parents grudgingly allowed paid $20, and I hid the cash in an envelope, taped inside my old chemistry textbook. Mom had started giving me the money directly instead of taking it herself, probably because she felt guilty about profiting from my language skills. I counted the bills obsessively, calculating how much I'd need for apartment deposits and food once I turned 18. Isabella's brother sent me information through her about emancipation laws and tenant rights, which I memorized during those supervised library sessions. Detective Medina showed up at our house on a Tuesday evening to update us about the case. He explained that the robbers' phone records led them to 2 other men who'd been involved in planning the robberies. They'd arrested both accomplices based on evidence from the first robbery, where the robber had killed a security guard. He shook my hand firmly and told me in the local language that I'd grown into someone who made a difference in the community. Dad actually translated this for Mom without being asked, his voice carrying something that sounded almost like pride. Detective Medina left his business card with his direct number and said to call if we ever needed anything. The summer program started in June, and I caught the bus at 6:30 every morning to make the 8 o'clock advanced mathematics class. The professor spoke rapidly in the local language while covering the board with equations, and I had to concentrate completely to keep up. My lab partner was a local girl who wanted to study aerospace engineering, and she helped me with vocabulary for technical terms. During lunch breaks, I sat with other students in the courtyard and listened to them discuss their plans for university. The professors started recognizing me after the first week, and one asked about my unique perspective coming from 2 educational systems. I wrote a paper comparing mathematical teaching methods that got passed around the faculty office. My parents read my progress reports with confused expressions, proud of the A+ grades but concerned about comments praising my cultural adaptation. Isabella got her acceptance letter to the same university where I was planning to apply, and we met at the coffee shop to celebrate quietly. She ordered us both iced coffees, and we sat in the corner booth where Mom couldn't see us from her usual waiting spot outside. Isabella's family had invited me to dinner 3 times, but I'd had to decline each time, though they understood and kept offering. She showed me the course catalog, and we picked out classes we could take together, planning a future that felt impossibly close and far away at the same time. Her parents had started referring to me as their bonus son and sent food home with Isabella to share with me at the library study sessions. Dad took the promotion at the end of July and announced we'd be staying for at least 5 more years. He framed it as purely career advancement, but I caught him looking at the local university's engineering program brochure that I'd accidentally left on the kitchen counter. Mom enrolled in basic language classes at the community center, claiming it was for safety after the robbery, but I saw her practicing pronunciation in the bathroom mirror when she thought I wasn't home. She'd made flashcards that she hid in her purse and pulled out at red lights. During a school assembly about college preparations, the auditorium got packed with hundreds of students and parents. The noise and heat and pressing bodies suddenly made my chest tight, and I couldn't breathe properly. My vision went blurry and I stumbled toward the exit, but my legs gave out halfway there. Simona appeared from nowhere and guided me to the health office, coaching me through breathing exercises while I gasped and shook. She called my parents and explained that panic attacks were common after traumatic events like armed robberies. Mom actually looked scared when she picked me up and didn't say anything about weakness or embarrassment. That night, my parents agreed to let me see a therapist who specialized in trauma and spoke both languages fluently. The first session was weird because I'd never talked to a stranger about personal stuff before. She had this small office with 2 chairs and a box of tissues on the table that made me uncomfortable just looking at it. I told her about the robbery, and she nodded while taking notes on a yellow pad. After 3 sessions, she started asking about my childhood and why my parents were so scared of losing their culture. She explained how immigrants sometimes hold tighter to traditions when they're afraid of disappearing in a new place. My parents had left everything they knew and built this bubble to feel safe. Understanding their fear didn't make their rules okay, but it made them seem less crazy. One evening, Mom knocked on my door holding a notebook and asked if I could teach her some basic phrases in the local language. She said it was for emergencies, but her voice was soft and unsure. We sat at the kitchen table, and I taught her how to say help, police, and hospital. Her pronunciation was terrible, and she kept mixing up the sounds, but she wrote everything down carefully in her neat handwriting. Dad watched from the doorway, pretending to read his newspaper. Every night after dinner, we practiced for an hour, and she slowly got better at the basic words. She even started recognizing signs at the grocery store and pointing them out to me with this proud little smile. Those evening sessions became the best part of my day because she wasn't trying to control me, just trying to understand my world. Graduation came faster than expected, and they picked me as valedictorian based on my grades and essay about cultural identity. I wrote my speech in both languages on index cards and practiced in front of the mirror for weeks. Standing at the podium looking at hundreds of faces made my hands shake, but I started speaking clearly in our language first. Then I switched to the local language and talked about building bridges between communities and finding strength in both cultures. My parents sat in the front row, and when I thanked them for giving me 2 homes to love, Dad's eyes got wet, and he had to wipe them with his sleeve. Mom grabbed his hand, and they both smiled at me like they finally understood who I'd become. The acceptance letter from the local university came with a partial scholarship for their linguistics program, and I accepted before my parents could debate it. They agreed to let me live at home while attending classes, which felt like a fair compromise since I'd get freedom during the day, but still follow their rules at night. Isabella got into the same program, and we signed up for 3 classes together, including advanced translation theory. Detective Medina called one day, asking if I wanted to work part-time at the police station, helping with cases involving expat families who couldn't communicate. The job would involve translating witness statements and helping officers understand cultural differences that might affect investigations. My parents actually seemed proud when I told them, and Dad told his colleagues I was helping law enforcement keep the community safe. The work felt important, and Detective Medina introduced me to other officers who treated me with respect. Isabella's mom called our house one evening, inviting all of us to dinner at their place the following Saturday. My parents whispered in their bedroom for an hour before Mom came out and said they would go, but only for 2 hours. Isabella's family lived in a traditional neighborhood with narrow streets and houses painted bright colors. Her parents served local dishes my parents had never tried, and everyone ate with their hands, which made Mom freeze until Isabella's mother showed her the proper technique. Her dad told stories about leaving his own country 20 years ago and how scared he was of losing himself in a new place. My parents relaxed slightly when they realized this family understood their fears, because they'd felt them too. A whole year passed since that day with the gun against my head, and everything was different but somehow better. I was taking 5 classes at university and getting straight A's while working at the police station twice a week. My relationship with my parents had found this weird balance where they stopped trying to control everything, and I stopped fighting every rule. We still disagreed about stuff, but we talked instead of yelling. Some expat families heard our story and started asking if I could teach their kids the local language before something bad happened to them too. I started teaching Sunday classes in our community center with 10 kids whose parents finally understood that knowing the language could save lives. My parents helped print flyers, and Mom even sat in the back of one class to watch me teach. The gun against my temple had forced all of us to face truths we'd been avoiding, and while we weren't perfect, we were finally honest about who we were and what we needed to become. All right, that's all from me today. Thanks for sticking with me, and letting me throw all my questions out there. Until next time, stay curious. Like the video, it helps more than you think.